The Trump administration is expanding its response into alleged fraud by childcare providers, with the Small Business Administration announcing the suspension of nearly 7,000 Minnesota borrowers. On Tuesday, the government froze childcare payments to the state. But it isn't just Minnesota. The administration now says it will implement new requirements for childcare payments nationwide. The move provoked by a viral video alleging fraud at childcare facilities across Minnesota, which has many daycare providers and families rattled, wondering what the cuts mean moving forward now. Maria Steffel, executive director of the Neighborhood Development Alliance in St. Paul, Minnesota, whose organization partners with a nearby daycare, spoke about the impact of the freeze on funding. Look at this.
You cannot blame an entire community or an entire group of service providers for a clip that is looking for fame. Everything is uncertain for me on what the outlook of 2026 might be.
And joining me now is MS Now reporter Alex Tabbitt. Alex, talk me through what we know about these allegations against these Minnesota borrowers and how the Trump administration is responding and leveraging all of this.
Well, Antonia, this bombshell announcement from the head of the SBA, Kelly Loeffler, is just the next installment of the Trump administration's federal funding crackdown on the state of Minnesota. In a post on X overnight, Loeffler wrote that her agency is suspending 6,900 Minnesota borrowers amid suspected fraudulent activity. Loeffler says those borrowers were enrolled in the Payment Protection Program and the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, which the state has been relying on heavily since the COVID-19 pandemic. And in total, Loeffler says that those now suspended borrowers were approved for about 7,900 loans worth about $400 million in total. She also said that these borrowers will be banned from future SBA loans, including disaster loans. And Antonia, it's important to note that Loeffler didn't substantiate or provide evidence for these specific claims, at least not yet. She hasn't given us the receipts. And this comes after the Department of Health and Human Services announced the freezing of about $185 million in federal funding that subsidizes childcare centers across the state of Minnesota. And those childcare centers are attended by about 19,000 children. So if the Department of Health and Human Services follows through with its recently announced plan to freeze all of that funding for childcare centers in Minnesota as they investigate fraud, it's going to have a huge impact on low-income families who have nothing to do with this potential scandal. And I say potential, Antonia, because the state of Minnesota has been investigating childcare fraud for years, and it's only come up with a handful of convictions, at least so far. So, Antonia, if you're picking up on a theme here, that's because there is one. The Trump administration announced the freezing of funding that will impact all of the 19,000 children who rely on these subsidized childcare centers, not specifically targeting the funds that may have been connected to fraud. The Trump administration is demonizing the entire Somali diaspora in Minnesota, some 81,000 people, not just the 85 people of Somali descent who have been charged in fraud schemes in the state. Antonia, collective punishment seems like the name of the game.
Alex, you've been to Minnesota recently and you've had the chance to speak to people there on the ground. What are they telling you about the kind of pressure they're dealing with, the threats, the rhetoric? What impact is it all having on the community there?
There is a pervasive sense of fear. I was in Minnesota, the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, and St. Paul amid the peak of the ICE raids. And I talked to some members of Somali descent, Somali diaspora, who told me that they were afraid to go pick up their kids from school. They were afraid to go buy their groceries. They were afraid to go live their everyday lives, even though they were American citizens, because of the racial profiling that they had seen on their streets, Antonia. And this is not dissimilar to what we've been seeing in so many other cities where these immigration raids have been cracking down. But the level of xenophobia from the president on down has really ramped up that sense of anxiety. Antonia?
Alex Tabbitt, thank you so much for your detailed reporting. Appreciate you. Joining us now, the executive director of Children's Action Alliance, January Contreras. She's also a former government fraud prosecutor. Good to see you, January. So You used to run the division of HHS, which distributes federal funding for places like child care centers around the country. What kind of impact could this decision have on all of these families?
Yeah, it's really important to understand that the headlines are very focused right now on Minnesota, but really all parents need to be paying attention to these headlines because, as was mentioned, we know potentially there are some bad actors, and there's a government fraud a lot. That's how I had a full-time job doing that at one point. But what we need to focus on is there is a lot of change being implemented in a very short amount of time. And normally when we're making these changes, we do that in lockstep with states. We give them notice, we help them put the tools in place that they need. We all are anti-fraud at our core. We don't want people taking advantage of government funds. And here we have kids, and parents are desperately in need of child care assistance. So we want to make sure every single dollar is made available for the children to be able to get child care. But it does create concerns when this is done overnight. And childcare providers, the childcare infrastructure is pretty fragile. We saw that during the pandemic when parents didn't have anywhere to help them get to work, safe, quality places for their kids to be. And when we are making change like this so quickly, we create those concerns again.
I want to ask you very quickly before I have to go to break, just for you to expand a bit on what you mentioned there, that typically HHS would work closely with the states on an issue like this. There would be a notification period. There would be time for an investigation to get the facts right first before you take drastic action. Is that right?
That's right.
January Contreras, thank you so much for breaking all of that down and for sharing your experience with us.